Carleton, let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Unfiltered. I'm your host, Chucks McFarlane. Much appreciate that perspective and the opportunity to learn from one another. Our stories are powerful and needed in the world. Took a pandemic like this for us to think. I have focused on using my art as a tool. Because the opportunities are vast. We have a crucial moment. Always being that's right now. We want more people on board. For justice, equality, and liberty. I'm your host, welcome to Unfiltered. Let's get started. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the show this evening. This is Unfiltered. I'm your host, Chucks McFarlane. We thank you for joining us this evening. We have a great show in store for you. We have Keenan Pratt, who's joining us from the capital of the US, and he's going to be providing us a segment. We have our guest, Mr. Kevin O'Meara, who's going to be joining us this evening to talk about some of the key questions that are the cause of some of the issues that we've experienced over the last a little while, and that is inequality in the world. So we have a great conversation this evening. We have a good number of host guests that are going to be speaking to this, and we encourage all of you to join. If you're watching and you want to share comments, you want to ask questions, you want us to react to some of your thoughts, please share them in the comment section. We will be happy to react to those. And if you feel like it, start a watch party, invite some friends to join, share the link, and encourage others to be a part of these conversations we're having. So thank you again for taking the time on this lovely Sunday evening to join us. And we recognize that it is Thanksgiving here in Canada. So before we proceed, I want to share happy Thanksgiving to all of our viewers, to all Canadians. It is a great time, despite what we are going through, to connect with family, whether it's virtually, and those who can have small in-person gatherings. I think that is something we are all looking forward to. So enjoy your Thanksgiving celebrations, and remember to be safe, be well, be healthy. All right, Keenan, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you for having me, James. Good to see you.
Yes. So, in your neck of the woods, there is a lot going down. And so, we wanted you to come on as a content contributor and do our segment today on event and community connections, right? So tell us some of the things that are happening down in your neck of the woods and how you are engaging in those and any other thing that you want to tell us.
Well, to be honest, and I hate to say it because I don't like using this word very much, but it's true at the moment. There's a lot of fear in the air. It's the most uncertain time in American history, and due to the connectivity of the internet, social media, people are really tuned in more than ever, and they're scared. People don't know what's going to happen after the election. People don't know what to expect with our economy due to the fact that many things in DC and other major cities are closed, like to never open again. There are restaurants, there are mom and pop shops that are closed. And then the ones who still have their lease and look to reopen, there's an uncertainty of when and how long that will last for those who are still paying rent on those places. So it's a wild time. So I'm, like I said, I'm curious what you guys think about it being across the border. What do you all feel about what's going on in America?
Oh, there's Wesley. Certainly, we do have a lot of opinions and views with respect to that. But I want to welcome Wes uh, for joining us. Wes is our co-host here at Unfiltered, and Wes will be contributing to the show
Mhm.
today. Wes, do you have something to say about what Keenan is talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a definitely a very interesting place. You know, has it always been has been historically the United States, but yeah, there's just been so much to really spectate around what's going on in the United States in terms of mishandling of the COVID outbreak, and now with the presidential election coming up. And so there's so much news to keep up with, and so many ways in which on the ground protests from different parts of the political spectrum, to characterize it that way, have been presenting themselves in the streets sometimes. And this is where it gets really troublesome, is when the protesters start to engage in conflict with each other, which we've seen some examples of that in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and other states and cities around the United States. So it's a very interesting time, like you said, very like especially uncertain time in American history, Keenan. And there's just what narrative is there to follow to try to make sense of what's going on. So in terms of some sort of semblance of what to expect coming forward, I've been taking an interest in the presidential elections. And I mean, that is no exception to the unique times that we are living in. The conditions of those debates, the presidential debate, and as well as the slightly more composed vice presidential debate. It's just, it doesn't really give you much hope. You kind of see, strategies being mobilized on both sides, and a real kind of clear indication that this isn't a simple kind of narrative of good and evil. A lot of people will try to pin the evil villain card on the Trump administration, and as accurate as that may be because of certain policy decisions and ways, conducting themselves and setting the agenda. Um, it's not necessarily just like this, this forced to rally behind on the left, so to speak, or the Democratic ticket. And so it is a really complex time going on in many ways in the United States. And and I think that open-minded people that get engaged, like you and I, we want to kind of open people's minds that it's not just anti-Trump. We want to push for something greater, and that something greater really isn't being represented within the election.
Well, to add to that, one of the things that I find interesting is that people don't seem to think about what happens after the election. There's so much energy focused around the election and who wins. There are people that are going to be angry on either side. Many of us know that there are going to be riots and chaos in the streets in some major cities or outlets in rural areas, because some people won't be happy if Trump wins and some people won't be happy if he loses. But even if this whole COVID thing came to a close right after the election or tomorrow, it still doesn't bring back those jobs right away. It's not like people are going to just open their doors and go grand reopening, because, like I said, many places are not reopening. And I know over 35 to 40 restaurants in downtown DC alone that have closed their doors for good. Many of them that have been on mainstays in the cities for 15, 20 plus years, and which would employ 40 to 50 people at least in many of these places. So even after the election, what will happen with the economy? Even if COVID ends, like I said. So those are the things that I don't think people are really thinking about. And no president, I don't believe, is going to just walk in and just save the day and change those things immediately.
Mm. So one of the things, just watching from outside, that I wanted to ask somebody like Kenan, who's right on the ground zero there, is what's your sense? How are people feeling about the direction that the country might take? I know we see a lot from polls and all of those things, but there's nothing better than the feeling that you get as a body on the ground. So what's your sense in that light as to how people are feeling about all of this talk that's happening, and what they think are real practical possibilities for something better to come out of it, as Wes says, because the media is also some part that we can't really just follow the way the media covers this thing. Sometimes it's not holistic. It's like one side is pitted against the other, and then there are issues that I could point out to that are not being discussed, but that would affect the ordinary person. but because those are more a little bit complex and multifaceted rather than, oh, this is a democratic point of view and this is the Republican point of view. So, what's your sense being on the ground as to how people are feeling?
Well, like you said about the news channels, they may not be holistic, but they work. And unfortunately, what they do is they definitely polarize people. And at this point, there are lines being drawn in the sand, even amongst family members. Even for the last, going on 4 years now since Trump has been elected, people have split up their families in times. People are no longer friends anymore because of their stance politically. Something that you used to be able to keep to yourself, now people feel like they have to wear a badge on their sleeve of what side they're on. And so, in all honesty, uh, because of our economy being down, all the lockdowns that are still in place in many states that are going back to lockdowns, and I believe wholeheartedly as it gets colder, there'll be more lockdowns and more cases of COVID, whether we as individual citizens believe COVID to be real or whether we believe it to be some type of elaborate hoax. Regardless of that, something more lockdowns will come. And because of that, more people are sitting at home and they're angry, frustrated. People's unemployment checks are coming to an end. Our government can't seem to come to any terms as far as like stimulus checks and things of that nature. So, in all honesty, I think that we're very much on the brink of a civil war. And many people, like myself, are aware of that. Many people don't think that's a possibility. They think that COVID will just go away, the jobs will come back, and then everything will get back to normal. But at the rate of the United States selling more guns than in any year in recorded history, even liberals who bought firearms, people who are afraid more than the last time Obama won election, which was another high year, because many gun owners are afraid that under Democratic presidents or even governments that you lose gun rights, and that's true to many of us. So when you vote for your lifestyle, you have to consider the options. With that being said, to close my point, I believe that we're coming close to that because whether or not it'll last for weeks or whether it'll last for months, when people are bored, don't have any money, and they're frustrated and the results of this election are going to cause some people to do some stupid things. And if the economy doesn't bounce back, then you lead people to do desperate things in the sense of wanting to rob their neighbors and steal from people and loot stores of that nature. So we're in a dark time, and I don't think it's anywhere close to being finished yet.
Hmm.
Thanks so much for that, Keenan. It's a really impactful perspective from someone that has your finger on the pulse of a really unique part of the world.
Yes, and we're going to continue to keep tabs, and we're happy or lucky at Unfiltered that we have you right down there on ground zero, and we're looking forward to your perspectives, but also the general perspective of the people and what's going on in the country as we inch closer and closer towards this election. So thank you so much for that perspective. And I'm sure our viewers would be very, very much looking forward to our next connection on this issue.
Thank you for having me again, guys.
All right.
See you
Thanks. That
soon.
was Keenan Pratt. He's down in Washington, D.C., right at the Capitol, and giving us some real perspective as to what is happening down there outside of what we hear from our generalized media bubbles. All right. And we will continue to have Keenan come up and update us on that and have some discussions with us. Um, we are going to progress into our next segment, and Wesley is going to lead that segment, and we will contribute as we go forward. So, Wes, over to you.
Great. Thanks again, Keenan. And so just to introduce our next guest. Our next guest is named Kevin O'Meara, an old soul embodied in a jovial physical form who exudes creativity and thoughtfulness. I met Kevin while we were both graduate students at the Department of Political Science at Carleton University. Kevin has a background in philosophy and is highly involved in campus life, having supported an engaged student community in capacities such as president of the Carleton University Philosophy Society, vice president of the Dead Poets Society, a member of the Carleton Academic Student Government, and a student rep on the University Senate. While he isn't hitting the books or engaging in the education of topics as diverse as Greek Antiquity to Neo-Marxism, Kevin can be found making music and experimenting with what I'll call eclectic neo-vintage fashion. Kevin hosted a late night radio show on the Carleton student radio station and has written stories on campus in the campus newspaper on multi-use community spaces and independent music. He himself possesses a range of musical talents that some of you may get a glimpse of in the foreseeable future, wink, wink. And a quick look at Kevin's Facebook wall as one record of his beliefs and expressions finds Kevin engaging in a range of important issues from structural racism to working class history to self-care strategies and myth-busting exposés that reveal the deeper truths of ostensibly democratic governments. Rather than just expressing his view, I find that Kevin uses these well-developed materials to provoke forward-thinking conversations. I've had the privilege of having many such conversations with Kevin, and I look forward to the one that we're hosting today. Today, we will be discussing the complex problem of income inequality and poverty and strategies to address increasing disparities in socioeconomic well-being, focusing mainly on Canada with a conscientiousness of this being a global problem. How are you doing, Kevin, today? And how are things where you're calling in from?
I'm great. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's beautiful weather here in Montreal, and I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, Chebs.
Nice background.
Thank you.
I like the plant.
Yeah, gives a little bit of life here in this otherwise dead wood pulp bookshelf that I have.
Right.
Yeah, they take on a different life in the written form. So you suggested that we discuss income inequality today. What does income inequality mean to you, and how is it measured?
So income inequality, while I was studying on it, was brought up by Barack Obama as the moral issue of our time. And all critiques of American politics aside, I do say that I have to agree with that statement, not only on a national level, but also on an international level. But I think that not only is the researching and understanding of income inequality important, but I also believe that the way we understand income inequality is very important as well. Income inequality, or talking about a gradational understanding of, say, lower class, middle class, and upper class, is actually a very recent way of understanding wealth and the structures of wealth in society. In the 19th century, there was much more of a focus on rather the relational implications of wealth and who owns the means of production, et cetera, that I'm sure we're going to get into in the future. And it's really important to me as well, due to my background. I come from a working class family. I grew up in social housing, had a single mother on disability growing up. So just the idea of poverty, the mental, physical, psychological effects of poverty are very close to me. And I think it's one of the most important issues to understand.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you. And so that really calls for an urgency in identifying it. And so how is poverty, or being on the low part of income inequality pointed to? Where is it represented? And how can we use that as a lesson on how it can be addressed?
So in Canada, there are a couple of different ways of measuring income inequality. The main way that we typically understand it is by market basket measure. So that's typically how much does it cost to have a basket of food and other essentials that are required to live a culturally acceptable standard of life. And according to this market basket measure, which is different in different urban areas, different in different rural areas as well, approximately 3.2 million Canadians are living below the poverty line right now. That's approximately 10% of the country living below the poverty line, many of which being children, and also affects different intersections of people quite differently as well, particularly racialized people, Indigenous people, women, children, all affected disproportionately by this. And another way that inequality is typically understood when you're comparing different countries is the Gini Index. So the Gini Index essentially measures the proportion of the country that makes a certain threshold of money and how wide the spread is of income inequality. Now, the Gini measure of inequality in Canada has substantially increased over the last 40 years. It's basically on a level of 0 to 1. The closer to 1 you are, the greater the inequality is. In the 80s, the Gini Index measured approximately 0.28, while today it measures about 0.33. So we can see that inequality is increasing, even though we hear more and more talks of reducing inequality and lifting people out of poverty more. So those are two kind of ways of measuring inequality in Canada.
Yeah. I also grew up mainly in a single mother household with my brother, and really saw how hard she had to work to raise us. And I think that because of that life experience, we're better for it, being conscientious of, specifically in the single mother household, of what poverty looks like. Other representations of extreme levels of poverty or patterns of poverty that come to mind for me are levels of food insecurity. Nova Scotia, where I'm calling from, has for the last 5 years been identified as the province with the highest levels of food insecurity, with around 1 in 7 people experiencing some level of food insecurity, which means an inability or a worry to afford the food they need to live a healthy life. And then when you focus on women and children, single mother families with children, which is the predominant pairing statistically, you then get to 1 in 5 of those family units experiencing insecurity. So it spikes when looking at women, single mother families with children. Another interesting study on the impact of income inequality was the 3 Cities of Toronto project done by John Helchansky, which demonstrated how from 1970 to 2005, increasing levels of poverty were prevalent, as well as, because of rising housing costs, identifying those low-income groups, which he roughly categorized as being 20% below the average income for all of those years, are being increasingly pushed out of the urban core where they used to be concentrated, low-income neighborhoods becoming more numerous, and pushed into the suburban, at times underserviced area, lesser serviced areas of Toronto. And so I think that was an amazing way to graphically demonstrate the long-term impacts of income inequality with rising housing costs. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, first of all, I was going to point out that it's neat that you raised the issue of food security. We know that the World Food Organization just won the Nobel Peace Prize for peace. It might seem strange to some people that it's the World Food Program, but it's exactly for this issue. Food security is an issue. It's prevalent in Canada. It's prevalent in the United States. It's prevalent all around the world, right, to different levels. So just something that we should point out, that when we talk about income inequality and we're linking it to food security, it's because all of these things intersect. And I also wanted to ask a question, which is part of that intersection, which is the issue of affordable housing as it affects income inequality, because as we know, in Nova Scotia, we have an affordable housing problem, that it seems everybody agrees, everybody wants to solve, but we're just not getting the framework of how to solve this issue. So perhaps, Kevin, in your discussions, you can sort of talk more about these linkages.
Yeah, absolutely. I think food security is one of the most important and immediate demands for people who are living in poverty, because it really is a physically taxing feeling that you get. That is one of the most prevalent feelings that you experience in poverty. And when you talk about poverty, it's not only food insecurity and also housing insecurity, but also the need for clothing, for shelter, for general education and security. So all of these things are interconnected, as when you have a lack of these qualities, you're living an impoverished life, but this also reproduces poverty as generations continue. Now, although a lack of housing is a serious crisis in Canada right now, we can see a decline in the amount of social spending going towards public housing projects. For instance, in the early 90s, in 1993, there was approximately 20,000 social houses built, whereas by 1998, only 5 years later, after some austerity measures were brought in by the Liberal government, only 2,000 houses were built, and that's about the level per year of social housing that's being built today. And this is in spite of the fact that people recognize that homelessness is a huge problem, access to affordable housing is a huge problem. We are in the greatest debt crisis in Canadian history right now because people can't afford their mortgages, their rents, etc. And not to mention that when social spending occurs at the root causes, when you eliminate hunger, when you eliminate homelessness, you're actually investing towards the future and spending less on healthcare down the line. You're spending less on policing communities down the line. You're spending less on putting people in prison and more on keeping people out of prison in the first place by investing in their livelihoods. So all of these things are definitely deeply interconnected.
Yeah, and investments in each of those areas that you mentioned in terms of addressing the lifestyle that low income subjects one to in the Canadian context have resounding effects in terms of improving people's lives and a capacity to contribute to society, which I guess is the overall goal within capitalist society. And then also we talk about how it's not just having like less money in your bank account, but you're subject to all these conditions of food insecurity and unaffordable rent, which then makes low income kind of increase exponentially and then throughout the generations, like you were mentioning. And so, I mean, there are many kind of solutions that are discussed and kind of policies that are called for, but like you said, there's less of a public investment in those needs, and I think more of a shift towards engaging in something that resembles a private-public partnership because of this. We're living in the era of just a full entrenched belief in the allocative wisdom of the market, which many people would say has demonstrably failed over the last decade, or as John Helchansky demonstrates from 1970 to 2005. The neoliberal experiment by many counts is a failure. And yet that is kind of the guiding kind of ethos for government's response to complex issues, is to partner with the market. And so what say you to those who see that the solutions to these problems lie within capitalism?
It's incredible that we're in the year 2020 right now, and we're still hearing people tout trickle-down economics as a valid way of increasing the well-being of any proportion of people. Empirical study after empirical study shows that fewer jobs are produced, there's less growth, and there's less of a increase in the well-being of people when money goes to corporations rather than being spent in public spending and infrastructure projects. An interesting report that I came across had showed that effective corporate tax rates have been drastically decreased in recent years. And if the effective corporate tax rate of 2008 had remained the same effective corporate tax rate in 2018, even if they had kept the identical level of the rate that it was at rather than dropping it, approximately $39 billion would have went to the federal government, $39 more billion, which is the equivalent of, doing the math, about 222,000 more jobs would have been created by the federal government in 2018 if they had just maintained the level of effective corporate tax rate from 2008, just by showing how tax cuts do not actually lead to corporations actually investing more, whether that be in research and development or whether it be in employing more people. And that's not even to mention other major problems with the Canadian tax system. Over $350 billion were sent to tax havens and that's just proven, were sent to tax havens by Canadian corporations in the year 2020 alone. And this money is not being reinvested for the public well-being of Canada. It's simply growing dead. Another study had recently showed that the amount of dead money, that's money that's not being reinvested, it's just kind of being kept under the mattresses of millionaires, has increased 340% since the year 2000. So empirically, not just like a battle of ideologies, but if you actually look at statistics, you can see that trickle-down economics does not work for working people or for people who are unable to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And then those who would argue that capitalist frameworks allows for an unrivaled capacity for upward mobility, that might work perhaps on an individual basis of people that are able to take those certain paths that are available. Giving your labor and parts of yourself over to the company that you work for is one way to excel, but at what cost? And definitely with many other kind of forms of social inequality, those paths are not available to many people. And so as many of us who engage in the study of the flaws of capitalism, and even those who are just conscientious enough to look around at their own communities, realize that there is this requirement for a low-income reserve army of labor at the foundation of a capitalist economy. And so, yeah, definitely some bold moves, some of which we hear mentioned in certain political campaigns and experimented with, but not wholeheartedly implemented, is definitely something that would be able to put at least a dent in current levels of income inequality and really turn around these trends that you mentioned. And thanks a lot for sharing those. Something's clearly not working. So what has the outbreak of COVID done to understandings of inequality and poverty, in your opinion?
I think that COVID has really shown the cracks in the system, so to speak. A lot of people who, it just completely blown open our understanding of how society functions. I think that a really important, one of many aspect is the understanding of essential workers and who actually is required for a functioning economy. So just to use a story a bit from the past, in the 80s in Ireland, investment bankers had thought that they were getting a bum deal from Ireland and had went on strike for better conditions, for more money. They were on strike for a week, 2 weeks, a month, 3 months, and society kept functioning as well as usual, with nobody really realizing that they had went on strike. Whereas you could see clearly, given COVID, if your cashiers at your grocery store, the people who stock fruits on shelves, if nurses, doctors, teachers, if they all went on strike, society would completely grind to a halt. But there actually seems to be, to a certain extent, an inverse relationship to your usefulness in keeping society running to the amount of money that you're actually making providing essential services to a society. There are exceptions here and there, but it's predominantly minimum wage making, low income, low labor standards, low workplace safety rights folks that are the ones who are actually keeping us alive and providing us food and shelter and the services we need.
Yeah, huge contradictions that have been exposed under what Chebs and I like to call the COVID-19 stress test, because we already had this flawed structure that really a lot of the problems that are coming up during the outbreak are a result of, rather than specifically a virus, which of course exacerbates many things. But those things were there already, very both morally and economically unstable. And so I was going to bring up a question about unions since Kevin brought that up, but if anyone else has a question before I get into that, have at it.
Yeah, I was wondering if Keenan wanted to jump in and contribute something. given that we've talked largely about Canada, and he's right there in the U.S., which is, the never down south.
It just seems to be this day and age that the more we're connected, the more we share things in common. Because I wouldn't have known listening to you, except for the few points that you made, that you were talking about Canadian issues per se, because they sound a lot of the same things that we have here in America, same problems. Whether it be the oligarchy that we have in state right now, or the way our capitalist society is ran, and nepotism, all run factors.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that's always surprised me as a difference between the United States and Canada is the percentage of the workforce that is unionized, which is extremely low in the United States, but then still has, both in the public and private sector, a foothold in Canada. Did you want to elaborate on what you feel the capacity of unionization to improve matters of income inequality and poverty are, Kevin?
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to mention that the impact of COVID in the United States has been incredibly tragic, and it's something that would be completely expected by people who have studied healthcare in the United States before, and who have studied the actual social structures of the United States before, that show that healthcare is extremely inaccessible, extremely expensive in America, and the general culture of individualism that is incredibly prevalent in the United States compared to a lot of other nations has led to a higher proportion of COVID cases than in the rest of the world. But that's not to say that the Canadian response has been particularly good either. I mean, rather than sending money directly to Canadians, the largest part of the Canadian response package to COVID has been going to corporations in order to help them pay the wages for the workers there, as opposed to the largest proportion going to workers and people themselves who are being impacted by COVID. So that response there just shows the myopic view of the Canadian government in deciding who actually gets to benefit or who gets saved, really, mostly from the COVID experience. In terms of unions, I would say that the Canadian unionization rate is certainly higher in Canada than it is in America, but the two countries have shared the exact same trend, where ever since basically Ronald Reagan and the neoliberal turn throughout the Western world, or the Northern world, starting in the late 70s, there has been extremely declining unionization rates. Canada has been cut in half, from about 40% in the early 80s to about 20% unionization at this point. And even America, which had a long, very storied history of unionization, ever since in particular, the complete dismantling of the Air Traffic Controllers Union in the 80s by Ronald Reagan. That was sort of a watershed point in the dismantling of unions across America. And unions are incredibly important, not only for collective bargaining, not only for advocating for higher wages, but especially in workplace safety measures, which we can see have been decreasing since in proportion to unionization rates, which is also tragic. Now, I would say that unions are incredibly important, but because of this historical amnesia that has accompanied the declining unionization rates, a lot of young people don't really understand the points of unions, or they don't really vibe with unions as much as, say, our grandfathers who were working in the old iron factory or what have you. And a lot of that is because of just the structure of capitalism at this point, where rather than working 40-hour-a-week jobs that were sort of won by unionization, millennials especially are increasingly put into precarious workplaces where you're not able to get enough hours to pay your rent, where you're not able to even find a job where you have a contract. There's a lot of 0-hour contract jobs where you end up working in the gig economy, whether that be through Uber or doing odd jobs on Kijiji, where there isn't really much opportunity to communicate with your fellow workers and bind together and start a union and collectively bargain, because in a lot of these situations, Uber in Canada is a recent example, you're not even considered an employee of what is ostensibly your employer, so you're not able to start unions. So it's definitely this confluence of factors, both historical and social now, that have led to weaker unionization and hence weaker wages and safety in the workplace.
Absolutely, yeah. We live in a new world now, and these categories such as contract employees really take, increase that precariousness of workers, commonly referred to as the precariat. And looking back at the big wins that the unionization drive in the earlier part of the 20th century were able to attain. I mean, employment insurance in Canada as a result of a huge discontent following the Great Depression of the 1930s. Attempted cross-country marches, starting I think in Winnipeg and then in Manitoba and marching towards Ottawa. Which were stopped by police quite violently. But then in 1940, William Lloyd Mackenzie King decided to make unemployment insurance a federal responsibility. And thinking about really how much of a solution, like, was that a breakthrough? Was that, a step towards revolution? Or was it something that kind of firmed up the existing dynamics, to kind of address some of those moral inadequacies, but still maintaining people within a very socioeconomic disempowered state, maintaining the system. And I see that kind of signs of that. And like you were saying, the kind of the bailout packages or the COVID relief going to employers to then be, maintain the structure of their organizations to then pay their staff in the traditional way, rather than doing something much more different, which would maybe give people a glimpse at how the system could be modified. So in terms of, we can talk about modifications that can already be witnessed around the world, or in North America, or more imaginatively, what types of changes do you think could possibly address income inequality or poverty in a significant way?
To address your implicit question of are these reformist tendencies like employment insurance good in the long run? I would say that everything from the not the Green New Deal, but the New Deal under FDR and a lot of these Keynesian economic policies that were happening in the early 20th century following the Great Depression were in response to the increasing militancy of the working class. You could see everything from the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919 to a lot of as you were mentioning before, workers in labor camps who were basically sent to dig ditches and fill them back in again and given like basic wages for that, because you can't just give money away to workers. There was an increasing militancy going on, and rather than allowing this militancy to rise, especially in relation to the Bolshevik Revolution, which was deeply inspirational for many Canadians that people kind of forget about now, big business and the government wanted to shut down this militancy. So people essentially gave up their rights to engage in more militant strikes in order to have a somewhat more stable labor relations with their bosses and whatnot, which allowed for the legalization of unions in the early 20th century, the formalization of how strikes go. But what you lose when you lose that militancy is you lose the drive to make your conditions better, and suddenly unions where the union stewards don't actually care about the working class end up developing, and you start getting reactionary unions. You start getting basically lower rates of militancy among the working class.
So if I may jump in here, just to ask a question that might give us some more perspective on our discussion. So Kevin, should we have, to use a loose example, should we have a space force or a task force to sort of explore beyond our planet when we have people in these countries who don't have homes, who suffer from food insecurity issues, who can afford the basics? What justification do we as citizens have when we allow our government to prioritize things that aesthetically we derive, the excitement from, rather than the things that actually morally, um, underpin our shared humanity, our common dignity as human beings, as citizens of these countries. So I'll just say this, there's a documentary on Netflix called Unacknowledged. I don't know if any of you have watched it, but in a sense, it talks about the shadow economy of governments spending huge trillions of dollars on shadow defense, shadow space projects, and all of these things. And it's not even in the budgets that are always presented to us as citizens. Yet, we allow those to happen because we say, oh, this is, whether it's defense or we say it's special, defense spending and all of these things. But at the same time, we fall into this political pond where it's, if you oppose it or you stand for it, it's politics. But yet we have people who, affordable housing is a crisis. It's been declared a crisis. Here in Nova Scotia, here in Canada, boil water advisories on reserves. We have all these practical issues that should be dealt with. But when it is time to deal with it, we have a figure placed. The government say, oh, this is going to cost money. This is going to cost X amount. We have to increase taxes to do this. But on all of these other, I'll call them adventurous projects, there seems to be no cap. There seems to be no concern about taxes and where the funds are going to come from. So how do we as citizens engage and hold the people to account so that we don't have to deal with these issues that affect us?
I think that's a great question, especially with reference to space travel, because there's a long history that you can unpack that goes from before space travel to just general exploration by European nations 1,000 years ago to today. A lot of people do argue and believe that explorers wanted to explore the world and discover new lands without acknowledging the actual economic purposes of exploration, which was to colonize and effectively enslave and also commit genocides around the world using like terrible Eurocentric white supremacist logics. Now, we have to understand that space exploration isn't just a means to exploring the cosmos and doing cool things. It was revealed just the other day that the space task force that Trump wanted to sort of invest a ton of money in the United States, it could actually, the plan is to be able to deliver weapons across the world in only an hour using like outer space technology, which shows that, again, so-called defense or security spending is actually what is underpinning this spending that's supposed to be just for the aesthetic or spiritual enrichment of a country. And I think that military spending is also really important to acknowledge, because the Canadian state is spending more on military budgets this year than any other year prior to this year. And this trend has been going up for years now. Could anybody name a war that Canada is in right now that necessitates the highest military spending in Canadian history? So this military spending isn't just so-called national defense, but securing economic interests, whether that be in the Middle East, in Africa as well, or even in South America. While Canada has this, while Canada's understood to be the peacekeepers of the world, there's actually a lot more sinister stuff going on by our military. Now, leading to the question, what can we do about it? I think that a lot of Canadians are deeply ignorant when it comes to knowledge about military spending. And I think that Canadians are kind of passive when it comes to letting the government do what they want. It might depend on who you are, it might depend on what part of the country you're in, what your social economic standing is. But a lot of Canadians are just trying to make ends meet and reading parliamentary budgets just is not a part of their general culture or not a part of their day-to-day lives. And I would at least hope that if people understood that if you cut military spending in half and put that money towards, say, education in Canada, you could 100% make post-secondary education free, using only half of the military spending budget. And like, you don't have to be ideologically committed one way or another to understand the economic benefits and social benefits and environmental benefits to divesting spending from war and the military and investing that instead in the well-being and education, and therefore the economic productivity of our country. So even adhering to an economic logic, the GDP will rise if you have a skilled workforce, which is developed by post-secondary educational training. So I would hope that if people were to pay more attention to how money is actually being spent and resources allocated, that people would start fighting for what I believe are the right things. But how you actually convey these messages and spread that message is a strategic problem that I think is open to debate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did want to give a shout out to organizations doing the hard work of mapping out where that change is, such as the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Ecology Action Center. They are doing the work of crunching the numbers and how they're currently, public funds are currently being spent and how they could be shifted to invest in necessary changes in both energy policy and so many other, just the daily lives of Canadians in our situation and also globally. Keenan, I saw you had your pen up a minute ago. Did you have something to throw in?
Yeah, just as you guys made some strong points about things that made me realize a current theme that I've noticed over a while. I feel like we're in a destabilization of our economy due to the fact that we've been living in a rich man's game that they call capitalism, which really doesn't have a means to an end. It's something that really will go on as long as they like it to. And as you said earlier about the dead money in Canada, it's that way now because what we've been watching is the richer get richer. Ever since, especially since in American history, we can look at like a J.P. Morgan loaning this country millions of dollars, but with high interest rates. Once we allow bankers and private entities to start financing countries, like here in America, once we got rid of the gold or the silver standard, that's when our money turned into those shadow governments. And that's when we had these rich billionaires basically playing with their money and doing what they wanted to. For example, you talk about NASA going to space. Some people strongly believe that NASA is just a black budget so that they can hide what they're actually doing with the money while they're pretending to be and doing things in space. Same way you look in America, you watch the Playboy Mansion basically be a brothel legalized. This is the same way you could possibly say the same thing about the model industry. They could be legalized hookers. So with that being said, one of the things you kept saying earlier was citizen. And I looked up the definition just to give the clear point is that it says a legal or recognized subject of a national of a state or commonwealth. And if we're citizens and we're recognized, first of all, by this commonwealth or the nation, a lot of us, like you said earlier about people being ignorant, are under what I call the illusion of inclusion. Many of us believe that we've had a play in this rich man's game of capitalism, but meanwhile, all they've been doing is using us to innovate, to work and do the jobs. But once the money has gotten them rich enough to where they can sit back and do what they want, and their jobs are no longer useful in some ways, what do they do with us? What do we do? So I think it's time for us to recognize that, we're not really a part of the fabric of the society. They're controlling everything down to the media and how we think. And many of us just don't realize it.
Absolutely, yeah. Don't just take what's on offer. Take what we deserve, right? And so not just trying to scrape by, but work towards a more healthy and just society, which is a hard thing to do, when you got to work every day. And so it really has this cyclical effect that keeps people in their place, and we have to work together, I think, to overcome it. This has been a really great discussion so far. So, I mean, if anybody has any other burning questions, have at them. But I would be interested in kind of just reflecting on. Yeah, I would actually like to hear some more suggestions from Kevin about how we could address income inequality and the side effects of huge disparities in wealth. And a second question would be, what would people be able to do? What new capacities would people have in a more income equal society?
Mhm.
I was just going to tag this on your questions. Do we need the semblance of another Bolshevik revolution? Uh, just to add some fun to it.
Yes.
Definitely. So to kind of like really get to the root of the question of income inequality that I kind of raised at the very beginning of the discussion was that there are two different ways of understanding poverty or income inequality or class. So a gradational way of understanding, or understanding it as a gradient, would be to argue that there is income inequality. It is bad. There is a lower, a middle, and an upper class, and there is this spectrum of the least wealthy to the most wealthy. This understanding of there being a gradient is where statements like the 1% come in, like the 1% being the wealthiest 1% of any given society. And this gradational understanding could be really simplified by an old Aesop's fable that you might have heard before, the grasshopper and the ant. So basically, under the grasshopper and the grasshopper is lazing around all summer and sees a bunch of ants working to collect food for the winter. The grasshopper says, "What are you spending all that time collecting food for? Just don't worry about it." But the ants are industrious, and lo and behold, when the winter comes, the grasshopper is freezing and starving, and the ants are doing just great. This is kind of an individualizing understanding of why people get wealthy or they don't. It's simply, if you work hard, you will get wealth in proportion to that. Whereas a more structural understanding of income inequality could be expressed in this metaphor. Wes, I know you've worked as a teaching assistant and also as a professor before. Consider the structure of a grading system in the university. You are deeply expected to grade on a bell curve. It's kind of taboo to talk about, but basically before the class even starts, professors or TAs are they know how many A's they're going to give roughly. They know how many B's they're going to give. They know how many C's they're going to give. So even if the person who gets an A was the hardest studier, the 2 or 3 people who get B's were the next in line. The people who get C's studied less hard than the people who got B's or A's. The actual grade that they get in the end is structurally determined by the professor who decides that they're going to be graded on a bell curve in the first place. And this is a more relational understanding. Under capitalism, there's not just simply people who make different levels of wages, but there is a working class and the people who own the means of production. And it's not that they're both working hard and depending on how hard they work, they both make more money, but rather the people who own the means of production, whether that be factories or think tanks or what have you, they directly make money that is proportional to the value of labor that the workers have put into the means of production, that they don't get paid for their labor. So for instance, in any given factory, if someone makes 100 shoes a day, they're paid in wages. They're not given the actual value or the amount or the profit that's made on the shoes in that factory. So in any given wages, the wages that you are given are probably equal to selling about 20 shoes, whereas the value of the rest of the 80 shoes that are produced go to the owner of the means of production. Now, this isn't just somebody working harder than the other person, but rather the ant in this scenario gets wealthier directly or inversely proportional to the amount of money that the workers have in this regard. So so in this sense, I'm kind of problematizing the idea of income inequality, where the point isn't just to make people more equal when it comes to wealth, but to actually eliminate these systems of inegalitarian productive relationships, which is a much more revolutionary rather than a reformist solution. Now, in terms of whether or not we need a Bolshevik revolution part two in Canada is I think, purely strategic question. I think more reformist solutions, like the redistribution of money, which could come in the form of UBI or increased public spending and closing down tax havens. While all of these solutions are good and would increase the well-being of the working class, at the end of the day, these are all market solutions and reform solutions that don't actually interrupt the property relationships. People would still own the factories and make money off them. People would still own land and make money off of people who are trying to live without dying and without starving. So more revolutionary approaches would be to actually change property relations at the point of production. So rather than just simply giving people UBI, which we can talk about, which we should talk about later, actually investing or trying to gain more political power in bargaining, whether it be in your workplace or developing sort of like more single payer amenities. So for instance, in Canada, we have single payer healthcare, where at the point of service, the government pays for your healthcare. We could also have single payer food or rent or other different amenities that are necessary for the well-being of human beings that are paid for through taxes rather than delivered by the market. But that is a more radical solution and is also worth diving more into.
Absolutely. I mean, so what I'm seeing from what you're saying is not just having a system that addresses income inequality by people having more money, but aspiring for a society in which how much money you have doesn't really matter that much and isn't a key determinant of your social well-being. And yeah, definitely something to set our sights on. And so you mentioned UBI as maybe one way to address the issues of poverty, in some ways, and income inequality. What would you like to say about that?
I think UBI, it comes from a good place and also doesn't come from a good place at the same time. It's very typical for people on the left to be very gung-ho about universal or unconditional basic income, where everybody gets, say, 125% of the money that, like compared to the poverty line, for instance. So in this circumstance, everybody's making over poverty wages. This opens up the opportunity to work or not work if you don't want to. It gives the opportunity of workers to bargain more, since there's going to be less of a reserve army of labor who are desperate to work. So there's going to be less people who are worried about being fired and leaving their jobs and pursuing other potentially more fulfilling things with their lives. And it also eliminates the social stigma of receiving one of the very many potential packages that you can receive as aid. It also, UBI would also help eliminate a lot of the bureaucracy behind, I know, like in Ontario, there's Ontario Works, there's employment insurance, there are pensions, you have disability as well. Now, I don't think that we should eliminate disability checks altogether, but eliminating everything from CERB to CESB to all of these different programs and replacing it with unconditional basic income would actually save a lot of money bureaucratically, and would also be a market sort of Keynesian solution. When more people have money to spend on goods, then that money is just being translated back into the economy. When someone is very, very poor and living paycheck to paycheck, all of their money is going back into the economy, as opposed to the wealthiest people whose money does not get cycled back into the economy because it gets sent to tax havens or it sits dead under their mattresses and not being reinvested. So this would actually be a worthwhile market solution that would benefit the bourgeoisie. But at the same time, there are some concerns with UBI because it may just end up being a free rent boost for landlords if there aren't proper rent controls. It could just be a reason for manufacturers to increase the prices of all their goods as well if there aren't proper price controls. So it's really important to strike that kind of balance. And of course, viability of UBI is a concern as well, because you want to make sure that enough people are working and making enough money to actually pay the taxes to fund UBI as well. That is a genuine concern. So there are a few different concerns, and UBI could also be used as an excuse to cut down social spending. So UBI was actually deeply supported by the Chicago School. Hayek and Milton Friedman had both supported UBI, not because they believed in equity and equality, but rather if you give people universal basic income, then you're taking away their ability to bargain in labor conditions. And also they wanted to strip away the voting privileges. They wanted to disenfranchise everyone who was on UBI or receiving these social payments rather than working, because they're not contributing to society, therefore they don't deserve a say in the running of society. So there is sort of a darker side to UBI. So even if in the future we're given a universal basic income, we have to make sure that social spending is also continued, because UBI is ultimately a market-based reformist solution rather than a fundamental revolutionary solution that changes property relations.
Uh, if I may jump in and offer some thoughts here. In terms of UBI, here's the fundamental question for discussion purposes that I always struggle with. So, for example, um, when we put spending into defense and all these adventurous projects that we have no real, we're telling the public that, hey, you know what? We're going to send a probe to Mars to see if there's life there. We don't know what the immediate value to that is, but hey, we're going to pump all these billions to create the, the rockets that are going to go and all the things that are going to monitor that. But hey, when it comes to putting money in the hands and pockets of people that are going to use it, then we start to say, oh, by the way, you know what, this might discourage people from working. Oh, by the way, so who came up with that measure of contribution to society by work? Is that the only measure we have? That if you work for somebody who owns the means of production, then you're a contributing citizen to society. What about just being a member? What about just being a human being and being a citizen and waking up every day and doing things that make your neighbors' lives better and doing things that make our world better? Isn't that a contribution to society? Why do we have to quantify through some form of, you have to meet what the owners of the means of production demand? And our governments get placated into accepting this measure, and that is why they are stifled. They don't have any power. And that is part of the reason why I said, do we need the semblance of a Bolshevik? Because what is going to change the political calculations of, we had for example, in Canada, we had a throne speech that did not really even contemplate, it did not even put out this idea just for conversation, not saying we're going to implement this, but say, hey, we want this to be an issue that people talk about more, universal basic income. These things are not even on the policy agendas of the major political parties. People talk about it as citizens. So where and how do we get there, where we prioritize these things without focusing on the, as we would call it, the bad sides of it, whereas there are other things that comparably we already know the bad sides, going to space while people are starving and don't have houses. That to me is a negative. So how do we get to that point where our institutions, those in power, the politicians, we drill it that this is what is a priority to citizens before these other things?
I think that under our current economic relations, the Canadian state and other capitalist states essentially function as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. To use an old statement, the state is putting public spending into infrastructure projects that are going to increase the GDP. The state funds education, primary education, because producing an educated workforce produces a more productive workforce. Putting money into military spending makes more money. Putting money into space exploration is essentially putting the basic level of spending that is going to be reaped by the Elon Musks of the world in the future. So it's all basically for the bourgeoisie to make more money at the end. But a lot of people are kind of tricked into thinking that going to Mars is just this cool thing that we decided to do, as opposed to an initial investment in what is probably going to be them trying to find natural resources they could find on Mars and things like that. So in terms of strategy, it's a really good question. I think that a lot of people are deeply emotionally and ideologically invested in the idea that you have to work to make a living, and anything other than breaking your back every day trying to reach the bare minimum is something worthy of shame. And if you look at the history of the development of capitalism as well, about 500 years ago, nearly every human being on Earth grew their own food and prepared their own food. There were immense common areas, particularly in Europe, where capitalism had originally started developing, where people just lived together and private property just did not exist. But as commons were violently taken over by states, whether it be in the 16th century and beyond, and as commons in Turtle Island, also known as North America, were taken over, and indigenous peoples were violently displaced. We've suddenly internalized this idea that you need to work really hard to survive, as opposed to recognizing the violence that preceded the conditions that we're living under now, and how these conditions are being sustained by people who have an invested interest in keeping us toiling away for their economic benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really tough question, because I think that the movement towards a more just society has to be mobilized on multiple fronts. We've kind of talked about the inadequacies of existing unions as they are now, and also the options at the ballot box. So that kind of guides us towards just kind of thinking about the complexity of this problem, and having, once again, as I say, we have to organize together to really mobilize on those various fronts. I think that Mark threw a challenging question to us scholars here, Kevin, about who really came up with this idea. And although the capitalist system that we live in now, of course, developed out of an existing class system, within mercantilism and feudal Europe through the course of the Industrial Revolution, and then was either further accentuated in a kind of this individualized kind of way of thinking about productivity within the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s. I would have to say an original contributor to the kind of thought that an individual needs to work to be considered a contributor to society, I'd pin that on Jeremy Bentham, and then his successor, John Stuart S. Mill, who had a concern and awareness about the poor and low-income class, but then thought that the best way to address their problems was to create poor workhouses.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, gentlemen, and I think that we can. There's room for more of this conversation, because we were just teasing the edges and dipping occasionally. So I don't know, Keenan, if you have something to say.
Only thing I want to add to that is when you talk about the downflow of capitalism, is I believe what we're seeing from the unions disappearing in the Americas over the years, down to the point of like not being able to use well water in many states now. It's just creating dependency. So it makes it easier more to conquer society and loyal citizens. Because at the end of the day, what will likely happen is we'll get to a point where, like I said, there are a lot of jobs that we have that no longer want to be needed. So then that universal basic income type of thing will come into play, because, hey, we'll give you money and handouts. But ultimately, the dream of being able to climb that ladder may very well be chopped in half at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it has been a really rich discussion. Really enjoyed it, and throughout the discussion, we kind of brought up these, more fulfilling things that people in a more income equal or egalitarian society would be able to engage in. Among those more fulfilling things, I would definitely see, increased political engagement, just more engagement in community life, which would, I think, create a more lively and diverse community. And so, although it is this, there's many moving parts, and there's this cyclical kind of nature to it, that you can't solve one part without solving the other. That in a more income egalitarian kind of community, we would have, I think, just more of a stability and a move towards this engagement. I think we would be able to take the next step in terms of our societal development. Another thing that people are able to do when they're not tired from work or at work is to be able to develop artistically. And like I mentioned earlier, Kevin is a very talented musician, and so I was wondering if you wanted to share some of that skill with us today before closing off the episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very nice.
And before I play this song that I'll talk a little bit more about, I just want to bring up a few last points. I think that we're reaching a pivotal moment now, especially in this moment where the seams of our economic and social systems are kind of being revealed and coming undone. The choice between socialism and extinction is becoming increasingly evident, where the environment can only take so much development, it can only take so much pollution and externalities that are developed by private corporations that are being borne by individuals, and radical, drastic solutions have to be made, as the scientific community says. And the only way to do that is by engaging in international solidarity with people. So in terms of future solutions, I think it's really, really important to not only get engaged in grassroots struggles, whether that be for environmental health or for making public transportation free or for social housing, but also in anti-colonial movements and anti-imperial movements, anti-war movements are really important. I think that engaging in broader struggles as well, whether that be and I know that I'm going to get flack from all sides of my political spectrum friends here, but whether it be engaging in electoralism or engaging in militant organizing to overthrow violent systems of oppression, whether it be giving money to people on the street or organizing reading groups with people to understand the world a little bit better and act on that. I think all of those are genuine things that we as individuals can do to make the world a better place. And to say one last word that I wanted to get in on income inequality in Canada, while income inequality is a serious problem and needs to be addressed, at the end of the day, Canada is one of the main exploiters of the global south in the world. About 50% of mining corporations in the world are either owned by Canadians or supplied by Canadians, and 2/3 of mining corporations in the world are headquartered in Canada because Canada's favorable tax policies. And some studies have shown that approximately $1.7 trillion a year are extracted from the global south to OECD countries as well, just due to imbalances, and everything from structural adjustment programs that are done by the Washington Consensus to debt peonage that occurs from global north countries lending to the global south that they know they can't pay back. All of these are very serious problems, and it's through this exploitation of the global south that the global north is even able to have welfare state spending, that Canadians have their health care, is because of the tax dollars gained by the federal government from corporations that are super exploiting people in the global south. So we have to acknowledge that any income inequality or poverty that exists in Canada should be seen in relation to the social services that we receive at the expense of other people in the global south. And I think that's really important to understand moving forward and trying to engage in more international solidarity movements.
Absolutely agree. Thank you very much for adding that.
Agree. Nice way to close it up.
All right, I'll just adjust myself here. I wrote this song that I think speaks to a lot of the things I've been talking about. And I wrote it just in the last couple of days because there's a lot of great old Union classics. There's a lot of great anti-war classics, but nothing that I could really think of that fully encapsulates a lot of the things we were talking about and I was planning on talking about today. So here's a little song of my own that I think encapsulates a lot of these ideas. Just get the lyrics here, haven't memorized it yet.
Okay.
With a spoon in my mouth and my boots on the ground, I was born in the projects in Ottawa town to a single mother on disability. Violence, gambling, alcohol, my friends, I saw it all. That's the way it is in poverty. Times were hard, I played on the streets, went to the food bank to make ends meet. But always, Mom always did what was best for me. In spite of all the fights we had, I grew up to understand and forgive her because we were in this together. People get together, solidarity forever. I tried to realize my wishes, push some tarts, wash some dishes, while the rich got richer off my labor supply. Bills were almost never met, I got married to be out of debt. Realized no matter how hard I tried. So I went to school, learned a thing or two. My knowledge had just grew and grew, but not nearly as fast as my credit speeds. So I got together with some friends I knew who were going for the same thing too, and mutual aid kind of like me. People, let's get together, solidarity forever. Now, I don't want to sound unforgiving, but the government owes us a living. Since we work and toil and struggle most our lives. Sometimes for laughs, sometimes for leisure, some time for arts, and some time for leisure. Because that's all we need to survive. So I don't understand why the people there have the guts to tell the people over here that we have endless money for endless wars. And we need healthcare, education, a healthy environment, transportation. Tell them we won't take it anymore. People, let's get together. Solidarity forever. We'll bring this world to greatest splendor with people of every ethnicity and every gender. All unite as one to end exploitation. Housing and care. Housing and care, not police. To build a safe communities. Found a new world on brand new foundations. I guess all I really want to say is, although humble beginnings come my way, a humble life is all I need. With friends and love and a clear blue sky, music to help the time go by, sounds like a pretty good life indeed. People, let's get together, solidarity forever.
Woo! Thank you very much. To our viewers, you can check out Kevin on Bandcamp. I found kind of a compilation of his work while I was researching for his bio. And I think we'll definitely have Kevin back on for a conversation on Unfiltered. And so, you know, we covered a range of aspects of income inequality and poverty today, you know, with touching on some solutions. And it seems to be, you know, whether we're, you know, writing a song and sharing it with each other to inspire, you know, vision, or we're storming the tax havens that we were talking about. You know, there are many different ways in which we can attack this problem. And I think, you know, first and foremost is not stopping talking about the issue. And that's what we seek to do here on Unfiltered, is keep these important conversations going. And thanks very much for joining us today. Chebs, you want to close us off?
Yes, thank you so much, Keenan, for bringing our community connection and the event. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was a nice number. We will have you again because this is a broad conversation that we need to continue and perhaps bring others to bring more perspective. Wes, thanks for being a rad co-host as always. And to all of our viewers, thank you. It's a Sunday, it's Thanksgiving. We wish you the best of Thanksgiving from our crew to your families. Enjoy the rest of the evening. And next week or in the next episodes, we have a little bit more in store for you. So keep tuning in, keep watching, stay connected. Have a great evening.
Thanks for having me. Good night.
Pleasure. Thanks again to Keenan Pratt from Washington, D.C., our community contact.
Thank you for having me.
So, host here, welcome to Unfiltered. I'm your host here, Chaps McFarlane. Welcome to Unfiltered.